This story is not about gold. That assumption alone has already misled most observers. Gold is only the weight at the end of the lever. The mechanism is something else entirely. When Germany asked for its gold back from the United States, it did not do so loudly. There were no emergency press conferences, no threats, no dramatic accusations. The request appeared procedural, administrative, almost boring. That is how structural shifts always begin. Public attention is trained on spectacle. Elections, wars, leaders, headlines. These are the visible surfaces of power. They move quickly, generate emotion, and disappear just as fast. But systems do not fail on the surface. They fail at their foundations. This action by Berlin was not a political message meant for voters. It was not a financial hedge in the traditional sense. And it was not a protest. It was a signal, not a signal meant for the public. A signal meant for other institutions that know how to read weight, custody, and control. For decades, Germany stored a large portion of its national gold reserves outside its own borders, primarily in the United States. This was not negligence. It was design. The post-war financial architecture assumed trust, permanence, and alignment among allies. That architecture is now under strain. And strain does not announce itself with collapse. It announces itself with requests. Requests that would never be made if the system were healthy. The popular explanation is simple. Germany wants better transparency, better accounting, domestic reassurance. These explanations are not wrong. They are incomplete. They focus on motives that are safe to discuss publicly. They ignore motives that are dangerous to name. Because the real question is not why Germany wants its gold back. The real question is why now. Gold stored abroad is not inert. It is collateral. It is confidence made physical. It underwrites currency credibility, sovereign balance sheets, and emergency liquidity arrangements that never appear in press releases. Moving gold changes nothing, unless the underlying assumptions that justified its location are breaking. And assumptions are breaking quietly. This request did not emerge in isolation. It appeared during a period of rising sanctions, weaponized finance, fractured supply chains, and growing mistrust between institutions that publicly still call each other partners. Military movements dominate headlines, but they are theater. Financial movements are the infrastructure beneath the stage. When gold moves, or when it is asked to move, it reflects a reassessment of risk that no military briefing will ever reveal. Germany is not questioning American strength. Germany is questioning access. Access under stress. Access during conflict. Access during policy divergence. In other words, Germany is not preparing for collapse. It is preparing for constraint. Constraint is the early phase of systemic failure. When systems are strong, custody does not matter. When systems weaken, custody becomes everything. This is why central banks speak softly and move slowly. Speed creates attention. Attention creates panic. Panic creates loss of control. Instead, institutions move with paperwork. They reclassify. They reallocate. They repatriate. Each move looks harmless alone. Together, they form a map. This documentary is not about accusing anyone of wrongdoing. It is about reading intent where intent is carefully hidden. The data does not suggest chaos. It suggests preparation. Germany's request challenges a belief that has gone largely unquestioned since the end of the Bretton Woods era, that the custodial center of the Western financial system is neutral, permanent, and immune to political leverage. That belief no longer holds universally, even among allies. And once belief fractures, structure follows. The media treats this story as a historical curiosity, a footnote, a relic of Cold War thinking. That framing is convenient and dangerously wrong, because what matters is not that Germany once trusted the system. What matters is that Germany is now planning for conditions under which that trust may not function. This is not a vote of no confidence. It is a recalibration of exposure. And recalibrations only happen when internal models change. This investigation will not focus on speeches or headlines. It will focus on flows, on custody, on timing. Because systems tell the truth long before leaders do. What follows is not a prediction. It is a structural reading. And by the end, the data will suggest something more unsettling than crisis. That the rules are still in place, but no longer assumed to work. What the data SOS Germany holds one of the largest national gold reserves in the world. This is not symbolic wealth. It is functional ballast. Gold sits on central bank balance sheets, not because it earns yield, but because it exists outside counterparty risk. It does not depend on another institution's promise. For decades, a significant share of Germany's gold was stored abroad, mainly in the United States Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This arrangement was built on three assumptions. First, that the United States would always be politically aligned with Germany. Second, that access to reserves would never be questioned, even in extreme conditions. Third, that global financial governance would remain rule-based rather than discretionary. The data now shows gradual deviation from all three. Germany began requesting audits, inspections, and repatriation well before public acknowledgement. These were not sudden decisions. They were phased, deliberate. The pace matters more than the volume. Institutions, under no stress, do not alter custody arrangements that have worked for decades. They do not absorb the logistical cost, political friction, and signaling risk of such moves without internal justification. The justification is visible in parallel data: sanctions frequency, asset freezes, financial weaponization, and the increasing use of reserve access as leverage. This is not speculation. It is documented policy behavior. Gold, in this context, becomes less a reserve and more a question of sovereignty. Why this behavior is abnormal. Allies do not normally repatriate reserves from each other. They especially do not do so while publicly affirming unity. That contradiction is the signal. Historically, gold repatriation occurs under three conditions: regime change, currency instability, anticipation of systemic fracture. None of these conditions are acknowledged publicly in Germany, which makes the behavior abnormal. If this were purely about domestic reassurance, Germany could have accepted audits or digital verification. Physical movement was unnecessary. Physical movement only matters when control matters. Control matters when legal access may diverge from political alignment. This action breaks an unspoken rule of post-war finance, that allies do not plan for each other as potential constraints. Once that rule is broken, even quietly, the system changes. Strategic interpretation. This is not a bet against the United States. It is a bet against predictability. Germany is signaling that future scenarios may include conditions where asset access is delayed, restricted, or politicized. That does not require hostility, only divergence. Sanctions policy has demonstrated that reserve assets can be frozen with legal justification and moral framing. What is applied to adversaries sets precedent for allies under stress. Germany is reading precedent, not intent. This is how institutions think. The move suggests internal modeling of scenarios where centralized custody becomes a liability rather than a convenience. This is not collapse logic. It is resilience logic. Who is absorbing the pressure? Pressure does not vanish. It transfers. As gold is repatriated, custodial institutions lose silent leverage. Trust becomes conditional rather than assumed. The pressure shifts to the system that must now prove neutrality under stress. This increases the burden on the dollar-centric architecture to demonstrate reliability not just in calm conditions, but in contested ones. At the same time, domestic institutions gain optionality. Optionality is the true currency of power, where the resources are actually going. The gold is not being monetized, that IT is not being sold, that IT is not entering circulation. It is being repositioned. This tells us the objective is not liquidity, but insulation. Insulation from policy shocks, from sanctions spillover, from legal ambiguity. Gold remains inert until it is not. That threshold is the entire point. Why this weakens one side and strengthens the other. Centralized systems depend on shared belief. Decentralized custody increases resilience, but reduces leverage. Every repatriation marginally weakens the assumption of universal trust. No single action breaks the system, but systems are not broken by single actions. They are hollowed out by many small, reasonable ones. Germany's move strengthens its autonomy. It weakens the gravitational pull of centralized custody. Not dramatically, but permanently. This moment does not resemble past turning points because nothing appears to be breaking. Markets are open. Institutions are operating. Treaties remain signed. Allies still speak the language of unity. And yet, something fundamental has shifted beneath the visible structure. In earlier cycles, instability announced itself loudly. Currency crises arrived with volatility. Political fractures arrived with protests. Military shifts arrived with movement that could be photographed. This time, the shift is architectural. It is happening at the level of custody, jurisdiction, and protocol. The level where systems prepare for strain long before the strain becomes visible. Germany's decision does not represent fear. It represents recalibration. That distinction matters. Fear reacts to headlines. Recalibration reacts to models. Models that now assume interruption rather than continuity. Models that no longer treat access as guaranteed. Models that accept that alignment can exist without absolute reliability. This is why comparisons to earlier gold movements are misleading. In the past, repatriation followed crisis. Now repatriation precedes it. That inversion alone signals a different phase of systemic behavior. What has quietly shifted is the definition of safety. Safety is no longer a place. It is no longer a partner. It is no longer a promise. Safety has become conditional, layered, and jurisdictional. It depends on legal control, political alignment, and timing. And timing is the most fragile variable of all. The assumption that assets held in allied systems remain neutral under all conditions has weakened. Not collapsed, not been rejected, simply weakened enough to require contingency. This is how systems actually change. Not through rejection, through qualification. Once assumptions are qualified, models must adapt. Once models adapt, behavior follows. That behavior is already visible, but only to those watching infrastructure rather than headlines. Gold is only one component. The deeper signal lies in how institutions are reorganizing exposure, reducing reliance on external custody, and increasing domestic optionality. Optionality is not aggression. It is insulation. And insulation only becomes a priority when pressure is expected, not necessarily imminent. Traditional safe havens were built for a world where rules were stable and enforcement was predictable. That world is fading, not collapsing. Fading systems do not trigger alarms. They generate friction, delays, exceptions, emergency frameworks that slowly normalize. In such an environment, safety cannot be static. It must be repositioned continuously. This is why Germany's move matters more for what it implies than for what it does. It implies that internal assessments now treat financial infrastructure as a potential vector of constraint, not because of hostility, but because of precedent. Sanctions, asset freezes, and legal reinterpretations have demonstrated that access can be redefined quickly under political pressure. Once precedent exists, risk models change permanently. There is no reversal of that logic. What happens next will not look dramatic. There will be no singular event that confirms the shift. Only accumulation, more repatriations, more domestic storage, more bilateral arrangements that bypass centralized nodes. Each action will be justified independently. Each will appear reasonable. Together, they will reshape the system's load-bearing structure. This is how old architectures fail, not through collapse, but through redistribution of weight. As weight moves away from centralized trust, centralized influence weakens, not suddenly, but irreversibly. No side wins this transition outright. All actors are constrained by the system they inherited. Even the strongest nodes must now operate under reduced certainty. That reduction does not produce chaos. It produces caution, and caution slows systems that were designed for speed. The most important thing to understand is this. Stability today is maintained by continuous intervention, coordination, and assumption management. It is not organic. It is conditional. When conditions tighten, friction increases. When friction increases, systems reveal their true design limits. Germany's action is not a warning. It is documentation. Documentation that trust has been replaced by verification. That permanence has been replaced by contingency. That safety has been replaced by positioning. This does not mean crisis is inevitable tomorrow. It means that the future will not be governed by the same rules that govern the past. Those expecting dramatic signals will miss the transition. Those watching structure will not. What matters going forward is not rhetoric, but protocol. Who controls assets? Under which jurisdiction? With what legal override mechanisms? And under what emergency conditions? These are not abstract questions. They determine outcomes long before outcomes appear visible. The next phase will confirm itself quietly, through legal amendments, through settlement rule changes, through the normalization of emergency language. By the time these shifts are acknowledged publicly, they will already be irreversible. This is how systems prepare for stress without admitting vulnerability. They move weight. They reduce dependency. They close exposure loops. Germany did not demand its goal because the system is failing. It demanded it because the system is changing. And systems do not announce that change. They record it. This was not a moment. It was a marker.